Welcome back to Crafting on a Budget, and in one of my previous videos we looked at how to make a no-cost journal, and we made one from an old calendar and one from a junk mail magazine. Now, before we start using these journals, the first thing we need to do is apply a coat of gesso to the pages, and what this does is to help seal them and prepare them for receiving any other mediums, paint and glue, etc. that we might want to put on them. So what we're going to do into the video today is we're going to look at a bought gesso, and we're also going to look at two different recipes for making our own. And I'm going to be testing these out for you on some of those pages in our journals, and seeing how they compare, and this way you can weigh up whether it's worth buying gesso or whether it's worth making your own. Right, so we've got our bought gesso, and I've got two pots here. One says plaster and one says talc. I don't know whether you can read those. And that's going to help me distinguish the two recipes that we're going to make. So it's basically the same recipe that I'm going to be using. But as is indicated on those pots, one is using plaster of Paris and one is using talcum powder. Now, when this happens to be baby powder, you can use whatever you happen to have or whatever you can find cheaply. This pack of plaster of Paris I found in one of our dollar type stores, and off the top of my head I think it was less than $10, and there's a kilo here, so that's New Zealand dollars. Alright, so the first recipe we're going to make for white gesso, you're going to need either plaster of Paris or baby powder, or any kind of powder actually. You're going to need PVA glue, and you're going to need acrylic paint, white acrylic paint that is. Now you will see that both of these I tend to buy in quite large quantities, and that is again for the money saving aspect. PVA is useful in a whole range of crafts, and again keep an eye out if you've got a dollar store that's got a good craft section. Quite often this you'll see is a 2 litre. Quite often you can find a litre or 2 litres and it works out much cheaper. When you're buying paints, and I will talk about this in more detail in another video, but if you're just starting out or your artwork is just for you, for your creative fulfillment, you don't need top quality acrylic paints. The student quality, so you'll see this one says middle school to college range, and that's a student quality paint. And you will find that those are perfectly okay for the vast majority of things you're going to be doing as a home crafter. So, but as I say, we'll talk about that in more detail. I buy black and white acrylic paint in these larger quantities. This is 750ml, just because they're colours I use a lot of, and the white in particular I use for making things like gesso and also for texture paste, which is something I'll look at in my next video. Alright, so let's get on. So in this recipe we're going to be using 1 part paint. So I've got some measuring spoons here, and this is a tablespoon. I'm just going to mix up a small quantity to start with, because that today will be enough for us to see how it goes. Now, you don't need to be absolutely exact, but roughly. So there's 1 part paint, and I'm just using a little plastic, what do you call them, trowel, spatula, something like that, to get it out, to get most of it out. Now it's not being very effective because that's a curved surface, so I am going to get my old brush. This is my glue brush, which I keep for things like this. I'll scrape the rest of it out. There we go. Alright, so that was 1 part paint, and we're now going to do 1 part PVA. Just put the lid on that so that it doesn't go anywhere. Now, I'm actually going to grab a wet wipe and just wipe this off, because I'm going to dip this into my plaster now. I'll just give it a bit of a dry. So what have we got? 1 part paint, 1 part PVA, and we're going to put 2 parts powder. Now this is plaster of Paris, so we're going to put 2 parts plaster of Paris. Ooh, my little containers might not be quite big enough, we'll see. Okay. I'll very carefully give that a mix. Normally when I make my texture paste I do it in a jam jar, which is a bit bigger, but I wanted you to be able to see this. I've just got some little pots that they've been recycled for some jellies or something else that came in them. Alright, so what we can now do is add water to the consistency that we want. So this is a little bit thick, and I'm just going to add a little squirt. I've got a spray bottle that I use. I don't want it too runny. Now you can, we each have a personal preference to the thickness of gesso and things that we use. The thicker your gesso, the easier and the better coverage you'll get. So it depends on your purpose. If you're wanting to hide everything on a page, then a thick gesso is going to be better. If you're just wanting to sort of knock things into the background, then by all means add a little bit more water, thin it down, and you'll get a thinner coverage. Okay, so there we go. That's the gesso made with plaster. As you can see, I have left that quite thick at the moment. I'm going to try it out quite thick, and then I will thin it down with a drop more water and try it again so that you can see the difference. Okay, so there's our plaster one. So we're going to do exactly the same process now, but we're going to be using talcum powder. I'm keen to try these out. I have made my own before. I've never done a sort of a controlled comparison, so I'm going to be really interested to see the results that we get. Now that feels as though it's a little bit thinner than the plaster of Paris without me even adding water, but I am just going to add a little squirt. There we go. The talc is slightly finer than the plaster of Paris, so we will get, we will get a slightly different coverage or consistency. That looks and feels as though it's smoother with the talc. Let's have another look. This is the plaster. The other thing I am conscious of with the plaster of Paris is that, as I say, it's actually a really, really warm day here at the moment. And one of the things I am wondering is whether it would start to set. So I don't know, but we'll find out, won't we? So if you are going to make it, probably a small quantity is a good thing if you're using the plaster of Paris. All right. I'm going to give my brush a bit of a... Oh, it probably doesn't need a wipe off, does it? It's only got glue and white paint on. Okay, let's make some space. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is, in each of these journals that we made, I'm going to gesso one page with the bought medium, one page with the talc mixture, and one with the plaster of Paris mixture. I'm going to see how the paint goes on, or the gesso goes on, and then we're going to have a look when they're dry and see what sort of coverage we've got. All right, so here's my bought one. This is a Reeves make. Again, this is a sort of middle of the road type make, and great if you're just starting out. I'm also aware that a lot of the dollar stores are now selling cheaper brands of gesso, so do keep your eyes out when you're out and about. Right, so this one, as you can see, goes on quite smoothly. It feels a bit like using acrylic paint, really. Got a couple of little blobs in here, but I think that's because I'm getting to the end of my tube and it's a little bit old. Yeah, there's a big, I'm just going to get rid of that. There's a big bit of skinny stuff there. As you could see, I was sort of having to squeeze the last of it out. Just get rid of that. If you do buy tubes like this, when you are right at the end and you can't squeeze any more out, it's always good to cut them in half, and then you can use your paintbrush and get the last dregs out. Right, so you can see that's given reasonable coverage on that calendar page. As I say, it feels a bit like using acrylic paint, this one. Blobs aside. Right, there we go. So let's put that one to dry. And we'll do exactly the same. Now, this is not good quality paper at all. This was the journal we made from the Junk Mail magazine. But this is in no way good quality paper. So gessoing your page before you use it is really important. So again, you can see that that bought gesso has given us reasonably good coverage. It's certainly starting to white out those pictures that are on the mailer. And you can always, if that's what you're wanting, if you're wanting a completely white page to work on, then you can always put a second coat of whatever gesso you're using. All right, so I'm going to have to leave those to dry before I come back and do the next page with the next gesso that we've made. All right, so it's been around about 5 minutes. Those two are nice and dry, so you can have a look and see how that's dried up. It's given us reasonable coverage on both the calendar and the magazine pages. Now, as I say, it depends what you want to use, the purpose of using your gesso, but I would always recommend it when you're doing something like this, particularly for calendars which have often got quite a shiny surface, because it will just, what the gesso will do is to give you, I need to concentrate on what I'm saying, it will enable your surface to take your paint and your other mediums much better than the shiny the shiny surface of the calendar or the very porous surface of your magazine pages. And when you're using something like this that has been upcycled and repurposed, then you often have pictures and things that you don't necessarily want. Okay, so a second experiment is going to be with the plaster gesso. And you'll see I've put a little bit of blue plastic between this page and the previous one. These sheets of blue plastic actually come from, I sometimes buy sheets of frozen pastry, puff pastry, and these blue sheets of plastic are between each of the sheets of pastry. And we haven't got the facilities here to recycle soft plastics very easily. And so I try to reuse things, and these are ideal for putting under your pages when you're doing anything like this. Okay, now this is the plaster one. It has got a slightly more grainy texture than the other gesso. It is mixed a little bit thicker at the moment, but I'm actually feeling like I'm getting really good coverage with that in terms of blocking out what's underneath. Alright, so that's the one in our calendar. Let's try with the magazine pages. So putting a bit of plastic or a piece of scrap paper in between your two pages like this, one, it means you can go right up to the edge of your page without worrying about what's underneath, and two, it will without worrying about your desk or anything. And the other thing it does is to stops your whatever medium you're putting on going through onto the previous page. So again, it feels a little bit thicker than the bought gesso. We could thin that down with water, as we know, but again, I'm getting a really good coverage there. Alright, so that's the plaster one. Again, we'll leave that to dry, come back and we'll try the talc. Now what I am going to make sure that I do is to wash my brush out quite quickly and quite thoroughly, and I might put something like a bit of cling wrap over that plaster one just to stop it drying up on such a hot day. So once again, those have both dried. So that was our plaster gesso. I would say, in looking immediately, it's got a little bit more tooth. It's a little bit more textured than the bought one, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. So I'm going to turn over now and do exactly the same, but I'm going to use the gesso we made with the talcum powder. And as you'll notice, I decided to do both sides of the pages, and particularly with the calendar, I wanted to see how it covered the photograph so that we could compare to that first page with the bought gesso. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing again with both. Can't win, can we? Right, okay, here we go. This is our talcum powder gesso. Again, I didn't put too much water in, so it's got quite a thick consistency, and that is something that you can vary according to your personal preference and your purpose. The other thing I meant to say, when you're mixing anything like talcum powder or plaster of Paris, it really is good practice to pop a mask on so that you're not breathing in any of the dust. And I have to say, I do normally do that. I didn't today because I felt it would probably affect your ability to hear me. But I think that's really important, especially if you do suffer with any kind of respiratory illness, or you're susceptible to anything like that. Please do look after yourself when you're crafting. Alright, so that feels like it's smoother than the plaster of Paris one. it is quite thick. As I say, that's how I've mixed it up. So I'll do that other page in a moment. Let's see how it goes on to our magazine pages. Let's move that out of the way. Excuse me. Yeah, so pretty good coverage there in terms of whiting out the background. There we go. All right, we will leave that to dry and I will do the other page as well. We'll come back and we'll have a bit of an evaluation of each of the different gessos that we've used. Okay, folks, so let's have a look and see. What you'll notice is I've written on the top corner of both of the pages in the different journals what gesso we've used, so that when I come to use paint or whatever other medium on this later on, I can also compare how they take the mediums. But at the moment, let's have a look at how they feel. So this is our bought gesso, our Reeves version. Nice and smooth. As I say, it does have some bits in, but that's because I think I'm coming to the end of my tube and it has got a few bits of skin in it. But reasonable coverage, you know, in terms of covering the paper and things, and it feels like a nice surface to work on. So we'll turn over to the plaster now, and I would say pretty good coverage in terms of covering up what's underneath. I touched this bit when it was still a bit wet. It certainly feels very grainy, and I don't know whether you can see that on the video. But there's a definite texture there. As I say, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that's a personal preference. But if you look at the comparison with the Reeves, the bought gesso, you will see that there is a lot more texture. Okay, so that's the plaster one. And again, I think it does depend very much on what you're going to be using this for, whether you want that texture or not. So let's turn over again for the talc. Oh dear, that was still slightly damp. I didn't realise that. Okay, that's all right. We'll work with that. So the talc certainly feels a lot smoother. It hasn't got that texture that the plaster's got. And I don't know whether you can see the comparison there. The plaster definitely has more texture. The talc is smoother, like the bought gesso. In fact, it's probably even smoother than the bought gesso, I would say. So the talc, again, it's given reasonable coverage. You will know I mixed it up quite thick. I didn't thin it down too much because coverage was what I was wanting for this purpose. Let's have a look on here. This is a little bit less smooth because the page closed up before it was quite dry. But again, it's given reasonable coverage over the bright photo, and it does feel a very smooth surface to work on, where I haven't got these lumps and bumps. All right, so I'm going to carry on. I'm going to use up the rest of those gessos that we mixed up, just to cover these pages, because in future videos we're going to be doing something to fill our journals using items that we have around home. But for now, I hope that's been useful. I would encourage you to try things out and have a go. As I say, I'll put the recipe I've used today in the description box below, and there are others online, I know, so you know, feel free to experiment. I think gesso is very much a personal preference thing. Also, when you're thinking about working on a budget, it's about using what you have. So if you have some old talcum powder at the back of the cupboard, then try the recipe with talcum powder. If you happen to have some plaster of Paris, I don't know, maybe your kids have been doing some plaster work at school or whatever you've been doing, you may have some plaster of Paris. Try it with that. So it's about using what you've got or what you can buy the cheapest. Okay, so have a go. Thank you for watching today. I hope this has been useful. Keep an eye out for other videos in this series. But for now, happy crafting on a budget. Ka kite anō.